The Galactic Empire did not arrive with fire in the sky or weapons blazing. They arrived with silence, inevitability, and arrogance. Their ships drifted into Earth's orbit like vultures, metallic predators poised against a prey they considered beneath them. Humanity had always been underestimated. The galaxy saw them as chaotic, unrefined, loud creatures who could never unite, who fought as much against each other as against their enemies. But the Empire made one fatal miscalculation. They believed they could take what they wanted from humans without consequence. They believed the price of theft would be silence. They did not understand that for humans, blood ties were not negotiable. On the northern fringes of a colony, 3 young girls were taken. They were not soldiers. They were not leaders. They were simply daughters, laughing only hours before in the safety of home. Imperial storm squads moved through the settlement with clinical efficiency, pushing aside resistance with precision fire and energy blades. The colonists shouted, resisted, bled, and fell. They were ignored, crushed beneath the weight of an empire that saw no value in individual life. For the soldiers, it was routine. A sweet. A harvest. Children loaded onto a transport, faces pale, eyes wide, cries muffled by the hum of containment fields. The ship rose into the sky and was gone, leaving behind burning roofs and shattered families most empires believed they could take and break without repercussion. They counted on fear. Fear was the tool that chained worlds. Fear was the reason countless species lay docile under imperial boots. But humanity had never been guided by fear. Grief, rage, defiance, those were their currencies. And when grief and rage burned inside the wrong person, the galaxy learned what kind of monsters humans could become. The abduction did not go unnoticed. The news carried quickly through smuggler channels, mercenary whispers, resistance bands. And every whisper carried a name. Baba Yaga. The name was not official. It was never spoken in the Empire's records. But soldiers in dark outposts muttered it when they drank, intelligence officers exchanged glances when the name surfaced in intercepted transmissions, mercenaries swore they'd never take contracts against her. She was a ghost, a myth, a story told to explain slaughtered squads and vanished fleets. Humans called her an operator, a survivor of wars the galaxy had never catalogued. Aliens called her a witch. But all understood one truth: when the name Baba Yaga surfaced, death followed. She had once been human like any other, flesh and blood, bound by laws and oaths. She had fought in wars, had bled in forgotten jungles and frozen wastelands, had carved her legend in operations the galaxy never recorded. And then she vanished. No one knew why. Some said she had grown tired of war. Some said she was hunted and forced into hiding. The truth was simpler. She had found something worth more than fighting. She had daughters. She had laid her weapons aside to give them peace. But peace had been stolen. When word reached her of the abduction, something in her shifted. 4 years she had walked as a shadow of who she once was, content to disappear. But with the loss of her girls, the shadow gave way to fire. The part of her the galaxy had feared was not dead. It had only been sleeping. And now it was awake. The Empire thought it had taken 3 helpless children. What it had taken was her blood. And for that crime, she would bring ruin. She was not alone in her wrath. Beside her was a creature, small to the untrained eye, yet infamous on Earth for its defiance of reason itself. The honey badger. It was not an ordinary animal. Generations of breeding, genetic splicing, and harsh training had turned it into something more. Its instincts were raw violence, its body a compact engine of destruction. Every predator feared it. Every prey envied its endurance. It had no sense of retreat. No sense of defeat. Plasma fire, blades, venom, traps, it ignored them all in the single-minded pursuit of tearing apart whatever stood before it. Baba Yaga called it her partner. The galaxy would come to know it as her executioner. The Empire laughed when they first heard rumors of her moving. Soldiers mocked the stories. Commanders dismissed the chatter. A woman and a beast meant nothing against dreadnoughts and legions. Yet beneath the arrogance, unease began to spread. Reports of stockpiles of weapons disappearing, of patrols vanishing without a trace, of signals cut off mid-scream. And in every whispered rumor, one detail remained the same: her oath. She would tear apart the stars if needed, one ship at a time, until she found her daughters. The galaxy had always feared humanity's capacity for violence, but it had dismissed it as undisciplined chaos. What it did not understand was the deeper truth: violence, for humans, was not random. It was adaptive. It was personal. Humans fought for reasons other species could not comprehend. For territory, for survival, for freedom, but most of all for family. A threat to blood was a threat that no human would forgive. And Baba Yaga was not an ordinary human. She was the embodiment of that principle. The first warnings came from smugglers who claimed to have seen her move through black markets, acquiring old war gear with quiet precision. She paid not with money, but with promises, threats, and favors that carried the weight of inevitability. Weapons once thought useless were reforged into instruments of slaughter. Scrap metal became mines. Chemicals became poisons. Every fragment of trash became a weapon in her hands. She needed no fleet. She needed no army. She was an army. The Empire's arrogance was its undoing. They dismissed her as one more rebel, a problem to be crushed when convenient. They failed to realize what was rising against them. The abducted daughters were not simply children. They were the trigger that pulled humanity's darkest instincts into the light. The Empire had dealt with human soldiers, with human colonies, with human diplomacy. But it had never dealt with one human mother who swore vengeance, and so the whispers grew. Mercenary captains abandoned imperial contracts, unwilling to hunt a woman whose legend included entire crews butchered in silence. Alien prisoners began to mutter prayers to her name, believing she was more than mortal. Imperial officers scoffed in public but carried unease in private. Every soldier understood that death was part of war. But the kind of death she brought was different. It was personal. It was intimate. She did not kill because she had to. She killed because someone had taken from her, and she would not stop until balance was restored, when her preparations were complete, when her partner snarled at her side and the first blood had been spilled. She sent a single message across the void. It was not a demand. It was not a threat. It was a statement. They had taken her 3 girls. And she was coming for them. The galaxy that had once dismissed humanity as loud and reckless finally began to understand. Loudness was not the danger. Recklessness was not the threat. The true terror of humanity lay in the cold, calculated wrath of a single human who had been wronged, and as she moved into the darkness of space, shadows following, whispers echoing, the Empire felt the first chill of fear. Not of armies. Not of fleets. But of a story they had dismissed as myth. Baba Yaga was awake. And with her walked the killer honey badger. Together they were not soldiers. They were extinction wrapped in flesh. And the galaxy had no idea what storm had just been unleashed. The Galactic Empire believed that humanity's fury would burn itself out. Their leaders thought the retaliation so far was nothing more than the frantic thrashing of a wounded species, destined to collapse once imperial fleets struck back in force. The assumption was rooted in arrogance, the same arrogance that had led them to slaughter children in the first place. They had never faced a species that used rage as fuel, that turned grief into strategy, that learned faster in war than peace. They expected submission. What they received was evolution. Humanity did not fight on the Empire's terms. They avoided the grand battles that the Empire's dreadnoughts demanded. Instead, they struck where the Empire was weakest. Convoys vanished into silence, border stations reported phantom signals before being annihilated, and entire garrisons awoke to find themselves surrounded by improvised human fleets that had appeared from nowhere. To the Empire, this was chaos. To humanity, it was the only rational response. Every word lost in the massacre became a rallying cry. Every name of a child whispered like a prayer before soldiers launched their attacks. Humanity no longer spoke of defense or survival. They spoke of justice, and justice in their eyes meant ensuring the Empire felt the same agony that had been inflicted upon them. Soldiers painted the names of lost colonies on their ships. Commandos carried photographs of children into battle, not as reminders of weakness but as sacred icons of purpose. Their enemies mocked it at first, calling it sentimentality. Then they began to realize that it was the very thing that made humanity unstoppable. Imperial analysts tried to understand the enemy they had awakened. They pored over human history, searching for patterns. What they found unsettled them. Humanity's story was one of constant struggle against themselves, of wars that spanned centuries, of revolutions and genocides, of survival on a world that had never been kind. Unlike most species, humans were not strangers to losing everything and continuing the fight regardless. Where others broke, they adapted. Where others surrendered, they resisted. The Empire had assumed that killing children would shatter human resolve. The analysts began to understand the truth. It had only given them a reason to fight harder. Human tactics grew stranger and deadlier with each campaign. They turned asteroids into weapons, fitting them with crude engines and guiding them toward Imperial starbases. They seeded shipping routes with mines disguised as debris. They converted cargo haulers into missile barges, launching swarms that overwhelmed even the most advanced Imperial defenses. Where Imperial war doctrine valued order and precision, humanity embraced improvisation and unpredictability. Nothing was too crude, nothing was too dishonorable, nothing was off the table. If it killed Imperials, it was a weapon. Psychological warfare became as important as physical destruction. Before attacks, human fleets sometimes broadcast recordings of children laughing or crying, a haunting reminder of why they fought. Imperial soldiers reported nightmares, paranoia, and desertions. Survivors of human race spoke of invisible enemies who appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly, leaving wreckage in their wake. Entire squadrons refused to patrol human sectors, not out of cowardice but out of sheer terror. Human captives of the Empire rarely returned alive, but when Imperial prisoners were captured by humans, they were often released after being forced to watch evidence of the massacres. These survivors became unwilling messengers, spreading tales of human vengeance across the Empire. They spoke of soldiers who fought with eyes burning with grief, of commanders who promised to burn entire fleets for every lost child, of civilians who volunteered for suicide missions without hesitation. To the Empire, it sounded like madness. To humanity, it was justice. The more the Empire struck, the harder humanity retaliated. Colonies destroyed were answered with fleets annihilated. Civilian deaths were answered with assassinations of Imperial officials. By the time Imperial commanders realized the pattern, it was too late. Humanity had adopted a doctrine that terrified even themselves. For every child killed, 10 Imperials would fall. The wider galaxy began to notice. At first, most species had remained silent, unwilling to challenge the Empire. But whispers spread of human victories, of fleets vanishing, of worlds liberated. Species long enslaved by the Empire began to hope. They watched humanity, not with fear, but with awe. Here was a species that had been struck at its most vulnerable point, and instead of dying, it had risen with fury that shook an empire. Here was a species that fought not for territory or conquest, but for vengeance, and vengeance gave them strength no one had seen before. Human innovation accelerated. Scientists worked around the clock, producing weapons and defenses far beyond what their peers expected from such a young civilization. Starship engineers used desperation as fuel, creating vessels that bent the rules of warfare. Civilians became part of the war effort in every possible way. Entire cities on Earth and the colonies became forges of war, where everything from drones to artificial intelligences was turned into instruments of destruction. Even art, literature, and music shifted, becoming hymns of rage and promises of revenge. Humanity became a species at war in its entirety. The Empire's high command tried to adapt, but their doctrine was rigid. built upon centuries of unchallenged dominance. They did not understand enemies who refused to fight conventionally, who thrived in chaos. They launched punitive expeditions, sending overwhelming fleets into human space, expecting to crush them with sheer numbers. Instead, they found themselves lured into ambushes. Fleets that should have been victorious returned crippled or not at all. Morale collapsed. Commanders began refusing assignments against humans, citing certain death reports filtered back to the emperor himself. At first, he dismissed them as exaggerations, as cowardice among his subordinates. But the losses mounted, and the excuses no longer sufficed. When an entire sector fleet vanished after chasing what appeared to be a small convoy, only to discover too late that the convoy was bait for an asteroid ambush, the emperor began to understand the scale of the threat. Yet his pride prevented retreat. He demanded annihilation, even as his empire bled. Meanwhile, human leaders no longer spoke of survival but of destruction. The war councils declared openly that the empire would not be allowed to recover. They would dismantle it piece by piece until no child, human or alien, would ever face such slaughter again. It was no longer a war of defense. It was a war of extermination not of innocence, but of an empire that had dared to kill the innocent. Imperial soldiers whispered legends of humanity's fury. They told each other stories of human warriors who fought on even when gravely wounded, who used their own bodies as weapons, who laughed as they detonated themselves amidst enemy ranks. They spoke of mothers who became snipers, of fathers who piloted suicide craft, of children who carried messages through blockades under fire. To them, humanity was no longer a species. It was a nightmare. Alien historians watching from afar began to write a new narrative of galactic history. For centuries, the Empire had been the unchallenged dominator of the stars. Now, a single species, younger and smaller, was breaking them apart not with overwhelming numbers but with fury and cunning. They realized the truth. The Empire had made a mistake greater than any in its long history. It had struck at humanity's children, and in doing so, it had revealed what lay beneath humanity's surface. The phrase spread through the stars, the other side of humanity. It was whispered by terrified soldiers, spoken in awe by oppressed species, analyzed by scholars, and debated by strategists. What did it mean? To those who faced humans in battle, it meant terror. To those who suffered under the Empire, it meant hope. To humans themselves, it meant a truth they had always known. When pushed beyond reason, when their children were threatened, they became something unstoppable. The turning point came when humanity launched a coordinated campaign across multiple sectors simultaneously. Imperial defenses, already strained, crumbled under the onslaught. Worlds once loyal to the Empire began to defect, joining humanity or at least refusing to resist them. The Empire had always relied on fear to maintain control. Humanity shattered that fear by replacing it with something stronger, rage-driven defiance. For the first time in centuries, the Empire began to lose not just battles, but legitimacy. Imperial intelligence agencies produced reports filled with desperation. They spoke of an enemy that could not be predicted, an enemy that used every resource, every scrap, every ounce of ingenuity against them. They warned that humanity's war effort was not temporary but sustainable, fueled by a cultural shift so deep that it bordered on religion. The cult of vengeance had become humanity's identity. The reports ended with a grim warning. If the Empire did not crush them soon, it would never be able to crush them at all. And the Emperor read the reports and dismissed them as exaggerations. Yet in his heart, he began to fear. He saw a truth he could not admit aloud. The Empire had awakened something it could not put back to sleep. Human fleets pressed deeper into imperial space. They bypassed strongholds, focusing instead on supply lines, communications hubs, and industrial centers. They struck like predators, tearing the Empire's veins and arteries while leaving the heart intact, knowing that a heart whistle. The Empire's patience collapsed into desperation. After countless raids, ambushes, and humiliations at the hands of a species it had once dismissed as irrelevant, the Emperor ordered a final campaign to annihilate humanity in its entirety. The plan was simple in design but arrogant in execution. Gather a coalition fleet larger than any in centuries, concentrate overwhelming force, and strike directly into human territory to decapitate their leadership. The fleet was so vast it blocked out the stars when assembled, its commanders boasting that nothing born of Earth could withstand such power, but the humans had anticipated this. They understood the Empire's doctrine better than the Empire understood theirs. Humanity had never intended to win small skirmishes. They had always been working toward this moment. They had studied imperial strategies, dissected their arrogance, and prepared traps not for patrols, but for the largest fleet the Empire could muster. The Imperial Armada advanced, confident in victory, only to find itself swallowed by silence. Human space seemed empty, devoid of resistance. World after world appeared abandoned, orbital defenses deactivated, starports evacuated. Imperial commanders mocked the humans, calling them cowards fleeing their fate. But every movement forward tightened the noose humanity had woven around them. When the trap was sprung, it shattered the myth of Imperial invincibility. Human fleets, hidden in asteroid belts and nebulae, emerged with precision strikes. Converted asteroids slammed into Imperial capital ships with the force of extinction events. Swarms of drones blinded targeting systems. Suicide vessels rammed engines into dreadnought hulls, detonating in white-hot bursts that tore through shielding. Gravity wells, seeded with mines and hidden artillery, trapped the Armada in killing fields from which there was no escape. The battle was not one-sided. Humans died in droves, their fleets torn apart in desperate charges. But for every human ship destroyed, 2 Imperial warships were dragged into the abyss with them. The fighting lasted for days, until wreckage drifted so densely it formed artificial rings around planets. When it ended, the greatest fleet the Empire had ever assembled was gone. Only fragments limped back, broken, haunted, and forever scarred by the truth. Humanity could not be crushed. For the first time in centuries, the Empire faced the possibility of defeat. Its borders crumbled as rebellions erupted across subjugated worlds. Species long enslaved rose up, inspired by human defiance. Where once the Empire had ruled through terror, now terror belonged to humanity, and it spread like fire through the stars. Imperial High Command retreated to fortified worlds, abandoning peripheral systems to save their core. But the humans followed, relentless. They dismantled supply chains, targeted shipyards, and destroyed communications hubs. Each victory fueled the next, each loss for the Empire deepened the panic. The invincible conquerors had become prey hunted by the very species they had underestimated. Reports reached the Emperor daily, each one worse than the last. Admirals begged for reinforcements that no longer existed. Governors demanded aid for worlds already burning. The Emperor raged, but rage could not restore fleets or silence rebellions. He saw the map of his empire shrinking, bleeding at the edges, and realized the truth he had denied for too long. By striking at humanity's children, he had not secured obedience. He had written the death warrant of his empire. Human fleets pushed deeper, no longer content to strike borders. They advanced toward the imperial heart, system by system, world by world. Each conquered stronghold became a staging ground for the next. Each liberated slave world added soldiers and supplies to humanity's cause. The war no longer belonged to humanity alone. It had become a galactic uprising, humanity the vanguard and symbol of vengeance. The final campaign began when human armadas surrounded the imperial capital sector. It had once been the seat of unchallenged authority, a beacon of power. Now it was a cage. The emperor, still clinging to pride, ordered his fleets to defend the capital to the last ship. They obeyed, but their hearts were broken. They no longer believed in victory. They feared humanity more than they feared their emperor. The siege was brutal. Human fleets did not bombard indiscriminately. They dismantled defenses methodically, stripping the capital's shield generators, crippling its orbital guns, severing its supply routes. They cut the empire apart piece by piece, ensuring its leaders understood the hopelessness of their position. Each broadcast from human command carried the same unyielding message: you killed our children. We will not stop until your empire falls. When at last the imperial defenses shattered, the capital was left exposed. Human forces did not descend with rage-driven slaughter. Instead, they surrounded the planet and sent a single transmission to the emperor himself: unconditional surrender or total annihilation. For the first time in his reign, the emperor trembled. He demanded negotiations, pleaded for terms that would preserve his honor, his dynasty, his power. Humanity's response was cold as the void: there is no honor left. You wanted to see the other side of us. Now you lie with it. The emperor delayed, hoping for relief that never came. His fleets were gone, his governors overthrown, his allies fled. At last, he surrendered, not out of humility but because he had no choice. Humanity accepted, but not with mercy. They dismantled the empire from the top down, stripping its rulers of authority, its fleets of ships, its legacy of dominance. The galaxy that remained was no longer bound by fear of imperial power. It was bound by fear of what humanity had become. In the aftermath, humanity stood before the galaxy not as conquerors, but as a reminder. They did not claim the Empire's throne. They did not seize its worlds for themselves. Instead, they left the ruins as a warning carved into history. The message was simple: harm humanity's children, and you will awaken a side of them that does not forgive, does not relent, and does not forget. Liberated species hailed humanity as saviors, but with trembling voices. They celebrated freedom, yet whispered of the fury that had achieved it. They wondered if one day that fury might turn on them. The question lingered in every council chamber, every throne room, every gathering across the stars. What happens if humanity decides it is wronged again? Human leaders offered no comfort. They spoke only of rebuilding, of honoring the dead, of ensuring their children would never again face such tragedy. Yet beneath those words lay a truth that every alien understood: humanity had revealed the other side of itself, and it would never fully retreat back into hiding. The galaxy had seen it, and the memory would never fade. Survivors of the Empire told stories to their descendants, cautionary tales wrapped in horror. They spoke of battles where human soldiers fought with smiles on their faces, of commanders who turned defeat into victory through sheer stubbornness, of parents who became warriors with vengeance as their only shield. They spoke of fleets that moved like predators, of strategies so unorthodox they seemed insane, of victories snatched from impossible odds. Above all, they spoke of a single unifying cry that echoed through every human voice, every weapon, every strike: this is for our children. Generations later, the ruins of the imperial capital still stood, untouched by reclamation. No species dared to rebuild it. It remained a monument, a scar, and a warning. Pilgrims from across the galaxy visited, whispering the phrase that had reshaped their history. They did not whisper it in reverence, nor in defiance, but in fear: never harm a human child, for in that act, the Empire had discovered a truth that would outlive it by millennia. Humanity was not the strongest species, nor the most advanced, nor the most numerous. But when driven to the edge, when forced to protect their young, they became something that no empire could withstand. They became the storm, the reckoning, the embodiment of vengeance. The galaxy moved on, but the lesson endured. Diplomats remembered it when negotiating with humans. Generals remembered it when planning campaigns near human borders. Parents of alien species repeated it as a fable to their children: never provoke humanity's wrath, for it comes not as soldiers or fleets, but as the fury of mothers and fathers who will burn worlds to avenge their young. And humanity itself, though it rebuilt in peace, carried the scar within. They knew what they had become in war, what they were capable of when pushed too far. They did not speak of it openly, but in every whispered story, in every caution passed from one generation to the next, the truth remained. There was the humanity the galaxy knew: the traders, the explorers, the dreamers. And there was the other side, the one that emerged only when the unthinkable was done to them. The Empire had sought to break humanity by killing its children. Instead, it had revealed to the galaxy a truth that would echo for all time: when you kill the innocent of Earth, you awaken a force that does not stop, does not rest, and does not forgive. You awaken the other side of humanity, and once awakened, it cannot be contained.